You wake to the sound of your own labored breathing, each inhale a monumental effort that sends waves of pain through your swollen chest. The silk sheets beneath you are soaked, evidence of a body under immense strain. Your stomach, distended to an unhealthy degree, presses against your ribs with such force that you wonder if they might simply snap like twigs. The servants hover at the edges of your vision, their faces masks of barely concealed revulsion as they wait for your next command. You try to speak, but all that emerges is a wet gurgle. A metallic taste fills your mouth, a warning sign from within. Your fingers, swollen like overstuffed sausages, fumble for the golden bell that summons more food. Even now, even as your body screams in protest, even as you feel his health deteriorating rapidly, the hunger remains. Not real hunger, not the clean need for sustenance, but something darker, an emptiness that food can't fill because it was never about the food. It was about filling a void so vast that all the delicacies in your kingdom couldn't satisfy it. This is how kings die. Not in glorious battle or peaceful sleep, but choking on their own excess, drowning in the very luxury they thought would save them. The man who would die from his own appetite wasn't always a monster of consumption. King Adolf Frederick of Sweden began his life in 1710 as a minor German prince, never expecting to wear a crown. He was handsome in his youth, cultured, well-educated, fluent in multiple languages, the kind of man who might have lived a comfortable life as a patron of the arts, hosting salons and supporting musicians. But fate had other plans. The Swedish throne beckoned, not because of his qualities, but because he was weak enough to be controlled. When he arrived in Stockholm in 1743 to accept the crown, Adolf Frederick was already showing signs of the compulsion that would destroy him. Court observers noted his unusual interest in the kitchens, his tendency to linger over meals long after other diners had finished. But these were minor quirks, easily overlooked in the excitement of a new reign. Sweden needed stability after years of failed wars and political chaos. If their new king enjoyed his food a bit too much, well, there were worse vices for a monarch. The early years of his reign seemed promising enough. Adolf Frederick was gentle, artistic, interested in promoting Swedish culture. He commissioned operas, supported craftsmen, took genuine interest in improving his adopted homeland. But beneath this placid exterior, something was already going wrong. The political realities of 18th century Sweden had made him, essentially, powerless. The nobility had stripped the monarchy of real authority, leaving him as little more than a figurehead who signed documents and attended ceremonies. Imagine the psychological torture of being called a king while possessing less actual power than your own servants. Every day brought fresh humiliations, ministers who ignored his opinions, nobles who barely concealed their contempt, a parliament that treated him like an expensive ornament rather than a ruler. He was king of nothing but his own dinner table, and so that became his kingdom. The transformation happened gradually at first, an extra course here, a larger portion there. The palace cooks, eager to please their melancholy monarch, began preparing increasingly elaborate feasts. French delicacies, German sausages, Swedish traditional dishes, exotic imports from across Europe. Each meal became a production, a daily theater where Adolf Frederick could exercise the only power left to him, the power to consume. His wife, Queen Louisa Ulrika, watched with growing alarm as her husband expanded. She was everything he wasn't, intelligent, politically astute, constantly scheming to restore royal power. Their marriage had been arranged for political advantage, but she developed genuine affection for the gentle man she'd married. Now she watched him disappear beneath layers of fat, his features blurring into a mask of excess that grew more grotesque by the month. The queen tried interventions, gentle suggestions about moderation, attempts to engage him in other activities. She brought in physicians who warned about the dangers of obesity, though 18th century medicine barely understood the connections between diet and health. But Adolf Frederick's response was always the same. A sad smile, a promise to do better, and then another summons to the kitchen for a midnight feast. What the court didn't understand was that the king wasn't eating for pleasure anymore. He was eating to fill an emptiness that had nothing to do with his stomach. Each bite was an attempt to swallow the humiliation of his powerlessness. Each feast was a futile rebellion against a world that had made him a puppet in royal robes. The food was medicine for a sickness of the soul, but like all the wrong medicines, it only made the disease worse. By 1750, 7 years into his reign, Adolf Frederick had transformed into something barely recognizable as the man who'd accepted the Swedish crown. His weight had likely doubled, though exact figures weren't recorded. Court paintings from this period show the artist's diplomatic attempts to minimize his bulk, but even their flattery couldn't hide the truth. The king's face had become a moon of flesh, his neck disappearing into cascading chins, his body requiring specially reinforced chairs and widened doorways. The physical symptoms were alarming enough. Constant shortness of breath that made climbing stairs impossible, gout that turned his joints into centers of crystalline agony, skin conditions where the folds of fat created perfect breeding grounds for infection, digestive issues that meant he lived in constant discomfort, alternating between constipation and severe digestive distress that required teams of servants to manage. But the psychological symptoms were worse. Adolf Frederick developed what modern medicine would recognize as severe binge eating disorder compounded by depression and anxiety. He would eat until physical pain forced him to stop, then wait just long enough for the sharpest discomfort to fade before beginning again. He knew what he was doing to himself. The knowledge added another layer of self-loathing that could only be temporarily silenced by more food. The court developed elaborate rituals around the king's consumption, meals that might take 4 or 5 hours, with dozens of courses presented in careful succession. The kitchen staff, now numbering in the dozens, worked in shifts to ensure a constant supply of delicacies. The royal physicians, having given up on prevention, focused on managing the inevitable consequences. They prescribed purges and bloodletting, the universal remedies of their time that only weakened him further. One particularly disturbing incident from 1755 illustrates the depths of his compulsion. During a state banquet, Adolf Frederick consumed so much that he began choking at the table. As courtiers rushed to help, pounding his back while he turned purple, a sudden physical reaction interrupted the meal. The king's first words upon recovering were to demand the next course. The German ambassador, writing to his superiors, described the scene as watching a man dig his grave with a spoon. His relationship with food had become deeply compulsive, rooted in psychological distress. Expressed through consumption, he would eat foods he knew would cause him agony, rich sauces that triggered his gout, heavy meats that his failing digestive system couldn't process, sugary desserts that sent his already damaged body into crisis. It wasn't pleasure. It was punishment, self-administered and relentless. His children watched their father's destruction with a mixture of disgust and pity. Crown Prince Gustav, who would later become Gustav III, was particularly affected. He saw in his father's weakness everything he swore to avoid. The contempt he felt for Adolf Frederick's lack of self-control would drive his own obsession with restoring royal power, leading eventually to his assassination. The sins of the father, manifested in gravy and pastry, would echo through Swedish history. Queen Louisa Ulrika made one final attempt at intervention in 1760. She arranged for the king's meals to be controlled, bribing servants to limit portions and hide the keys to palace storerooms. For a brief period, it seemed to work. Adolf Frederick, denied his usual excess, began to lose weight. His breathing improved. The court dared to hope that their king might yet be saved from himself. But addictions don't yield to external control. The king, displaying more cunning than he'd ever shown in politics, began bribing his own servants with promises of rewards and positions. Secret food caches appeared throughout the palace. Hidden passages to the kitchens were discovered. One night, guards found him in the wine cellar, not drunk on alcohol but secretly eating preserved food in the cellar, overwhelmed by emotion as he ate with the desperate efficiency of a man who knew he might be discovered at any moment. The queen gave up after that. She retreated into her own interests, leaving her husband to his slow suicide. The marriage that had begun with political calculation and evolved into genuine affection ended in mutual isolation. They lived in the same palace but different worlds, she in her salon discussing Enlightenment philosophy, he in his chambers drowning in cream sauces and self-loathing. By 1770, Adolf Frederick's condition had deteriorated beyond any pretense of normalcy. He could no longer walk without assistance, his legs unable to support his massive bulk. Special chairs had to be constructed to hold his weight. His breathing was a constant wheeze, audible from rooms away. His skin had taken on an unhealthy grayish pallor, marked by chronic skin irritations in affected areas. The court physicians documented symptoms that paint a picture of multiple organ systems failing simultaneously. His heart, forced to pump blood through an impossibly enlarged body, showed signs of severe strain. His liver, overwhelmed by constant rich food, was almost certainly cirrhotic. His kidneys struggled to process the waste products of his excessive consumption. His pancreas, battered by decades of sugar and fat, was likely failing in its insulin production. Modern medical analysis suggests Adolf Fredrik suffered from metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, congestive heart failure, severe sleep apnea, and probably several other obesity-related conditions. But 18th century medicine could only observe the symptoms without understanding the underlying mechanisms. They noted his constant thirst, his frequent urination, his wounds that wouldn't heal, his episodes of confusion and lethargy, without recognizing them as signs of advanced diabetes. The king's mental state deteriorated alongside his physical health. He experienced what observers described as melancholic episodes, where he would refuse to see anyone for days, communicating only through written notes demanding specific foods. These periods alternated with manic phases where he would order fantastic feasts, sometimes for himself alone, consuming amounts of food that would satisfy a dozen normal men. February 12, 1771, began like any other day in Adolf Fredrik's edible prison. He woke gasping for breath, as usual, required 3 servants to help him from bed, as usual, complained of chest pains that had become his constant companion. The court physicians examined him and prescribed their usual useless remedies. No one suspected this day would be different. The king seemed in relatively good spirits at dinner. He'd been planning this meal for days, discussing with the kitchen staff exactly how each dish should be prepared. The menu was a testament to both 18th century culinary ambitions and one man's complete surrender to his compulsions. It began with lobster served in a rich cream sauce, the shellfish swimming in butter and cognac, each bite a small bomb of cholesterol and sodium. Next came the meat course. Not one dish but several. Roasted goose stuffed with prunes and apples, venison and wine reduction, ham glazed with honey and cloves, beef tongue and mustard sauce. Each dish would have been a meal in itself for a normal person. For Adolf Fredrik, they were merely stages in his final performance. The vegetables, such as they were in 18th century Nordic cuisine, came swimming in butter and cream, potatoes mashed with more butter than potato, cabbage rolls stuffed with pork and rice, turnips glazed in sugar until they resembled candy more than vegetables. Even the bread, fresh from the ovens, came with dishes of seasoned lard for spreading. Between courses, the king paused only to belch and loosen his clothing. Observers noted that he seemed to be eating with unusual determination, as if racing against some invisible deadline. His face, already flushed from exertion and poor circulation, grew increasingly red as the meal progressed. Sweat poured down his forehead, despite the February cold. Then came the desserts. This was Adolf Fredrik's particular weakness, his sweet tooth as insatiable as his general appetite. Apple tarts with vanilla sauce, marzipan sculptures shaped like fruits and flowers, cookies flavored with cardamom and cinnamon, preserved fruits swimming in syrup, and finally, his favorite, semla. Semla was a traditional Swedish pastry, a wheat bun filled with almond paste and whipped cream. During Lent, these were supposed to be eaten in moderation, a small indulgence before the fasting period. Adolf Fredrik ordered 14 of them. 14. Each one a caloric bomb of refined flour, sugar, and dairy fat. He ate them methodically, dunking each in warm milk, the cream oozing out with each bite. By the 13th semla, even the jaded court observers were alarmed. The king's breathing had become labored beyond its usual wheeze. His face had gone from red to an alarming purple. His hands shook as he reached for the 14th pastry. Someone suggested, perhaps, His Majesty had enjoyed sufficient dessert. Adolf Fredrik's response was to stuff the entire final semla into his mouth at once, cream spilling messily across his face. What happened next was predictable to anyone with basic medical knowledge, though it shocked the 18th century court. The king clutched his chest, his eyes widening in surprise and pain. He tried to speak but only managed a strangled gasp. His body, pushed beyond its final limit, began shutting down. The massive intake of food had triggered what modern medicine would recognize as acute pancreatitis, possibly combined with a heart attack. The court physicians rushed to attend their monarch, but there, the treatments proved ineffective. They attempted bloodletting on a man already in shock. They tried to induce vomiting in someone whose airway was compromised. They applied hot poultices to his chest, while his heart struggled with its final beats. Through it all, Adolf Fredrik remained conscious. His expression softened, as if resignation had replaced struggle. The death took 2 hours. 2 hours of gasping, choking, and gradual system failure while the court watched in horrified fascination. Queen Louisa Ulrika was summoned but refused to come, sending word that she had said her goodbyes to her husband years ago. Crown Prince Gustav arrived to witness his father's final moments, his face a mask of disgust and determination. In his final minutes, Adolf Frederick tried to speak. Witnesses disagree on his last words. Some claim he asked for water. Others insist he requested more cream for his semla. The most reliable account suggests he simply whispered enough before closing his eyes for the final time. Whether he meant he'd had enough food or enough life remains unclear. The autopsy, performed with the primitive tools and limited understanding of 18th century medicine, revealed the extent of internal damage. The king's heart was enlarged to nearly twice normal size, its muscles stretched and weakened. His liver was a mess of fatty deposits and scar tissue. His stomach was distended with undigested food, its walls stretched paper-thin. His intestines showed signs of chronic inflammation and damage. But perhaps most striking was the sheer amount of fat. Layers upon layers of yellow adipose tissue that had to be cut through to reach the organs. The court physician, in his official report, noted that the king's body contained enough excess fat to fill several large buckets. This detail, grotesque as it was, became part of the popular legend of the king who ate himself to death. The official cause of death was listed as digestion problems, a euphemism that fooled no one. Word spread quickly through European courts about the Swedish king who had committed suicide by semla. Satirists had a field day. Cartoons appeared showing Adolf Frederick ascending to heaven on a cloud of whipped cream. Moralists used his death as a warning about the dangers of gluttony. Politicians pointed to him as an example of royal weakness and decadence. But beneath the mockery lay a more complex truth. Adolf Frederick wasn't simply a glutton who lacked self-control. He was a man destroyed by circumstances that made food his only source of autonomy and comfort. His death by desert was the final act of a tragedy that began the moment he accepted a crown that came with no real power. The psychological autopsy of Adolf Frederick reveals more than his physical one. Here was a man suffering from what modern psychiatry would recognize as severe depression, anxiety, and binge-eating disorder. His compulsive consumption was a symptom, not a cause. The cause was the impossible position of being a king in name only, trapped between the expectations of royalty and the reality of powerlessness. His story resonates because it's not really about food. It's about how human beings respond to systemic humiliation and helplessness. When denied agency in the larger aspects of life, people often exercise extreme control over the few areas left to them. For some, this manifests as eating disorders. For others, different forms of self-destruction. Adolf Frederick's particular tragedy was that his coping mechanism was both visible and fatal. The modern world has its own Adolf Fredericks. Not kings dying of 14 pastries, but ordinary people eating themselves toward death for reasons that have little to do with hunger. The epidemic of obesity in developed nations isn't about lack of willpower or ignorance about nutrition. It's about emptiness that can't be filled, stress that can't be managed, and lives that feel as powerless as that of an 18th century puppet king. We see them in the statistics: the person who gains 100 pounds after a traumatic divorce, the teenager who eats to cope with bullying, the office worker who medicates job stress with fast food, the retiree who fills empty days with endless snacking. Each one attempting to solve emotional problems with physical consumption, just as Adolf Frederick tried to eat his way out of political impotency. The food industry, like the palace kitchens of Adolf Frederick's time, stands ready to enable this destruction. Foods engineered to trigger addiction, marketing that links consumption with happiness, portion sizes that would have shocked even 18th century nobility. The king's 14 semlas seem almost quaint compared to modern eating challenges and competitive consumption events that celebrate dangerous excess. But there's a crucial difference between Adolf Frederick's time and ours. We understand the mechanisms now. We know about insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. We can map the neural pathways of addiction and the hormonal cascades of stress eating. We have treatments, therapies, medications, and surgical interventions. Yet the fundamental problem remains unchanged: people trying to fill emotional voids with physical substances. The king's death also speaks to larger themes about power and consumption. Those with the most material resources often display the most disordered relationships with those resources. Whether it's food, drugs, money, or other forms of excess, privilege can become its own prison. Adolf Frederick had access to unlimited food, but no access to genuine satisfaction. He could command any dish, but couldn't command respect. He could fill his stomach, but not his soul. In death, Adolf Frederick achieved a kind of immortality he never found in life. He became Sweden's most memorable king, not for any achievements or victories, but for the spectacular manner of his demise. Schoolchildren still learn about the king who ate himself to death, though the lesson they're taught rarely explores the deeper tragedy. He's reduced to a cautionary tale about gluttony, his complex suffering simplified into a moral about moderation. Yet perhaps there's value in remembering Adolf Frederick more completely. Not just as a symbol of royal excess, but as a human being destroyed by circumstances beyond his control who responded to systematic powerlessness in the only way available to him. His death by Semla was absurd, yes, but no more absurd than the political system that created the conditions for such a death. The palace where Adolf Frederick died still stands in Stockholm, now a museum where tourists photograph the dining room where a king ate his last meal. The kitchen that produced his fatal feast has been preserved, its massive ovens and preparation tables a testament to royal appetite. But the real monument to Adolf Frederick isn't in these physical spaces. It's in every person who has ever tried to swallow their pain, eat their emotions, or fill their emptiness with something that only makes it worse. On this February day over 250 years later, somewhere in the world, someone is eating their 14th metaphorical semla. They know they should stop. They know it's killing them. But like Adolf Frederick, they've confused consumption with control, fullness with fulfillment. They're dining at their own last supper, one bite at a time, hoping that the next mouthful will finally satisfy the hunger that has nothing to do with food. The king is dead. Long live the king. And somewhere, in the shadows of history, Adolf Frederick's ghost reaches for just one more pastry, forever trying to fill an emptiness that food could never touch. His tragedy wasn't that he ate too much. It was that no amount could ever have been enough.